Hey, thank you so much for joining us at our Crosspoint Church podcast. Now, if you're new to our podcast or maybe new to our church in general, we're just a bunch of messed up people who don't have it all together, running after a heavenly leader who loves us and meets us right where we are. We hope this message encourages you, builds your faith, and strengthens your confidence as you continue down this journey of what it means to know and follow Jesus. Enjoy this message.
Hey, welcome again to Crosspoint. If we've not met, my name is Abby, and I am so thrilled to get to be with you this weekend. Whether you are here in the venue right now or if you're joining us online, let's make some noise for those who are on Crosspoint online, wherever you are, hopefully somewhere sunny and lovely. So excited that you are here. And as you've already heard, this weekend we're talking about the waiting, how sometimes the waiting can really be the hardest part. And so I wonder, as you think about your life, what is it that you are waiting for these days? When I was growing up, this was a really easy question for me to answer because in my family of origin, I was the youngest kid by a literal decade, 10 years. And so my brother and sister were always in this totally different stage of life. They had these freedom and opportunities that as a kid, I just thought was so amazing. And so as they'd experience these cool things, I'd ask my parents over and over again, when will I get to go to the movies with my friends by myself? Or when will I get to go to prom? When will I get my driver's license? Yeah, on and on. And every time the answer was the same. 10 more years. That sounds like a life sentence to a child. I don't know if you remember how long 10 years felt back then, but it was this torturous thing, and it's still this joke that comes up sometimes in my family because it was such a common experience. Although I have to say there was a time where the tables kind of turned, and especially when my siblings were like these sleep-deprived new parents, and I'm like in high school, college, living my life, having a great time, all of a sudden 10 more years didn't seem like such a bad thing anymore. I don't know how you feel about waiting. Maybe you kind of like the anticipation of it. Maybe you're on the other end where I am, where you just really can't stand it. If you can avoid waiting at all, you will. Maybe you feel a little like this woman does.
I'm 36 and I've never been married, so I've never met the one or whatever, but even though I've never met this guy, I think about him. I wonder about him, like, what is he like? Where does he live? What does he do? I'm thinking he's got to be pretty special, right? But I don't think we should hype up our soulmates this much because I've been waiting my entire life to meet this one man. And I'm not trying to sound mean, but I know he's not going to be worth the wait. I'm sure he's a nice guy, you know what I mean? But it's just going to be some guy named Greg in a graphic tee. If someone pointed at Greg and said, Leslie, you get to marry this man, but you have to wait 36 years, I wouldn't even get in line. Okay? You understand? I'd wait half an hour tops for someone like Greg.
Now, no offense to any Gregs in graphic tees, but I love her honesty of that, right? Like, there's so many things that we wait for that later we realize, man, that just was not even worth the effort. So often in life, we don't get to decide if we wait, though. Life is full of situations where we have no other option. Maybe right now, you're right in the middle of one of those. Maybe you find yourself waiting for a fresh start or a new adventure. Maybe you're waiting for a job change or for an answer, a test result. Maybe, like her, you're waiting to find your person or to find someone new now that you're starting over. Maybe you're waiting to grow your family or for a crisis to subside or for a breakthrough to come. There's so many things that we find ourselves waiting for. And when we're in this place, when we're in a time of waiting, one of the questions that I think is always coming to our mind is when? When will this be over? When will we get past this? When will we get to the next thing? We want an end date. We want a timeline. But so often there is no answer to be found to that question. In many of our most difficult seasons of waiting especially, we have no idea how long it will last. Today, we're going to look at a story that Jesus made up that has some things to teach us about how to wait, especially in those times where we have no idea how long the waiting will last. In this series, over the last several weeks, each week we've been looking at a different story that Jesus made up. And you may have heard these stories referred to before as parables. This is kind of the more common way to talk about them. Essentially, these are fictional stories that Jesus uses to explain something that is real and true. They're stories with a spiritual point. And what I love about them, and also sometimes hate about them, is that there's always details that are left out. They're intentionally elusive. They leave some questions unanswered. And it's because Jesus wants us to lean into them a little bit, to engage our imaginations, to wonder, to draw our own conclusions. The story that we're going to be digging into today is short. It's just 3 verses. You're welcome. And it's also one that's not super well known. We find it in Luke's account of Jesus' life. There's a similar story that is a little more commonly talked about, but this one, most of us probably have never heard the whole thing. It begins like this. Jesus says, "Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks." Now, the context of this, Jesus has just finished this really famous spiel about not worrying. Don't worry about your life. Don't worry about what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear, but seek the kingdom, and all of these things will be given to you as well. He's just gotten done telling this crowd that where they invest their time, their energy, their treasure, they'll find that's where their heart is too. And then he goes right into this story about some servants or slaves who are waiting for their master to come home from a wedding. Now, as we look at how this story begins, to be dressed for action literally meant to have your waist belted, or
all right, everyone, gird your loins.
Literally, to gird your loins. I really hate that phrase, but for some reason I hate it less when Stanley Tucci says it, so we're doing some Devil Wears Prada this weekend. So here's what this is about. Back in that time, everyone, men and women both, wore these long, loose tunics, kind of like what I'm wearing right now. And typically, it was so hot there that you would leave it as loose as you could to keep as cool as possible. But when you needed to move quickly, when you needed to do something active, it would get in the way, right? And so you would add a belt or you would tie it up so that you could be ready to easily move around. And so Jesus is saying, this is what these servants in the story, this is what they needed to do. He's basically like, suit up, stay ready, get your boots on. I feel like there's a How I Met Your Mother fan in the room. Me too, love it. Similarly, the second instruction, oil lamps in that time were extremely difficult to light in the dark once the light had gone out. And so this was common, that a servant's job would be to stay awake and keep the lamps burning until the master of the home returned. Now, in this story specifically, these servants have no idea when their master is going to be coming home. See, a wedding celebration back then wasn't like now. It wasn't this one-night ordeal where the venue closes at midnight, and so you can guess that probably, unless they hit the bars, they're going to be home about after that. At that time, wedding celebrations lasted like up to 7 days. And so they literally had no clue when he was going to return. This would have been a multi-day and night ordeal of them being expected to stay ready. Remember, they're not going to get like an "I'm on my way" text, which my husband, I think, would have really thrived in this time because he still thinks that's not a thing that you can do. So thank God for Find My Friends. But nobody else is married to someone like that. So thank you. In this parable specifically, what Jesus is referring to is the end of time, when he will return, and he's telling his disciples to stay ready as they wait. And I'll be honest, my initial reaction to especially the beginning of this story is that it stressed me out. It feels a little like something that like the people on the bullhorns as you're going into the Indy 500 would be shouting at you. Like it's this threat. You never know when I'll return. Stay ready. It feels a little like Jesus' version of a teenager's parent telling them, you never know when I might check your phone. Teenagers in the room, you feel that, right? This story used to raise a lot of questions for me. Like, how do I know if I'm ready? How do I know if I'm doing enough? And actually, I think that Jesus meant for us to react to it this way at first. One of the reasons that this story doesn't get talked about very much is because we think this is the whole point of it, but it's not at all. Another reason I think this story doesn't get a lot of airtime, especially in contexts like ours, is, let's be honest, it feels uncomfortable for us that Jesus is comparing God to a master and people to slaves. We don't love that, obviously. Now, slavery was pretty different back in that day than our modern understanding. It wasn't a racial thing. It was usually connected to debt. It wasn't necessarily a permanent status. There were ways that you could work yourself back to freedom. Not that it was a good thing, though. But here's why Jesus is using this imagery here. He's using it because he knew that this would be something that people who are hearing this story immediately understood. That slaves or servants were people who saw themselves as not worthy, either because of choices that they had made or circumstances that had been forced on them. And so he's using this imagery to speak to the places in our lives where we feel unworthy, where we feel unseen, overlooked, out of control of our own lives, so that he can flip it all upside down with a surprising turn of events in the story. Let's keep going. Let's get toward that. In verse 37, Jesus says this, "Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes." Now, the surface way to read this verse is that people who are ready and waiting for Jesus to return will be rewarded with heaven. But that's actually only part of what's happening here. See, in the original language, this word blessed isn't referring to a future reality, but it's actually referring to a condition that already exists. So the meaning is not the servants who are awake and ready when their master returns, then the master will reward them. Instead, what Jesus is saying here is the ones who are eagerly expecting the arrival of God are already blessed, right here, right now. He's saying that when we live with expectancy, when we live on the lookout for God, what we will experience is goodness, both now and forever. Now, maybe as you think about this, you're like, yeah, there's not a lot about my life that feels very blessed. I'm having trouble connecting with this because, if I'm honest, where I feel is forgotten. I feel unseen. I feel worn out, low on hope. If that's where you are, here, I think the story is for you in ways that you can't even yet imagine. I think what Jesus is trying to make clear to us through this parable is this. On your darkest night, when it feels like God is far, you are at the forefront of God's mind. Jesus is promising us here to return, and not just someday at the end of time. This is a promise that he makes good on again and again and again if we stay awake, if we keep looking for him. And it gets even better. Look at how Jesus describes what happens when the master returns. He says, "Truly, I tell you, he, the master, will dress himself to serve. He will have them, his servants, his slaves, come and recline at the table, and he will come and wait on them." This was so shocking that the master, who these servants have been waiting to serve, actually turns the table and begins to serve them. There is literally no other parallel story to this that exists other than Jesus' own move to wash the feet of his disciples. We see no other examples of such a stunning reversal of roles. See, when God comes, this is what God does. He prioritizes being with us. He gets on our level. And what Jesus is suggesting here is that he even serves us. That's wild. Now, in this parable in particular, the fact that these servants are reclining at the table means that the master is about to serve them some food, which may cause you to ask the question, what food will he give them? Which is a very good question, because they would not have been expecting him to return home hungry. They knew he was at this wedding feast, and so likely there was no food that was prepared and ready to go for him. So what some scholars think, is that Jesus is suggesting the master actually brought the food home with him. That while he was away partying, while he was at the wedding, he remembered his servants, whom he loved. And he brought them a taste of the wedding feast, of where he had been. Can you imagine what they would have felt like as they realized what was happening, as they tasted this delicious food that he had brought just for them? It reminds me a little of a few weeks ago, my husband went out with some friends, and it was one of those nights where I just was having trouble falling asleep, and so I ended up waiting up for him. I don't normally do this, and he came in the door at, 1:30 a.m. and had a to-go box in his hand, and he said, "Do you want some Kilroy's breadsticks?" And oh my, if you've ever been offered a Kilroy's breadsticks, any time of day really, but especially in the wee hours of the morning, you know how exciting this unexpected gift was for me. If you've never had a Kilroy's breadstick, this is your next step for this week. You can mark it on your connection card. You're welcome. But as I enjoyed that breadstick, I was just so grateful for the gift that I didn't see coming. I imagine that's how these servants would have felt in this story. What Jesus is doing with this parable is he is painting a picture of how much God cares for us. He's trying to help us see what he has done for us. See, Jesus came to give us a taste of the party, to help us experience the kingdom of God that is both here now and not yet, to show us the way to live fully now and forever. He came to give us worth by helping us see ourselves the way that God sees us, loved, cared for, chosen, valued. He came so that we could glimpse the heart of God that beats with self-emptying, sacrificial love for everyone. See, this is not a story that has any threat to it. It's not about fear or warning. It's a story to encourage, to remind us of the character of the God who is with us in the waiting, whose entire aim is to write a good story with your life. And so as you think about the places where you find yourself waiting and whatever delay you are experiencing, this is the God who will show up for you. I love also in this story, Jesus gives us some helpful things to do in the meantime. I think he gives us some examples of what to do while we wait. The first is to figure out what it looks like for us to wait with expectancy. See, just like the servants in this story, Jesus invites us to live every day with expectancy, to actively be on the lookout for the ways that God is at work in our lives and in the world. On every trip that I have ever led with students in my decade plus of student ministries, including the CSM group who's getting ready to head to Orlando, Florida for the International Youth Convention in just a couple of weeks, this is the first rule that I give them. Approach this week with expectancy, not expectations. Now, I didn't come up with this. I learned this from one of our favorite mentors around here, our friend Ann Smith, who, if you don't know Ann or have never heard her speak, she is a 98-year-old who is more full of life than perhaps anyone I've ever met, who's constantly learning and excited about the things that she's learning. And Ann often has talked about how most of us live in relationship to our expectations, how we are so consumed with the expectations that we have of ourselves, of life, of the people around us. And those expectations set us up to be disappointed. They steal our joy. And so she talks about what it looks like for us to make the shift from living with expectations to living with expectancy. How expectancy actually frees us to see each day as an adventure, to see good things as a bonus, to receive life as it actually is. Maybe for you, a next step this week is to figure out what it might look like for you to cultivate a spirit of expectancy, to stay awake. Perhaps you'll even begin by just making a list of ways that you are noticing God, noticing good around you. Another invitation that we see in this story is to become like God in the way that we show up for the people around us. Now, of course, none of us can do what God does, but we can follow this example to serve like the God who served us first. God who not only sees the people who the world calls unworthy, but actually leaves the party to come and be with us. There's this man named Father Gregory Boyle who lives this way in a way that's so inspiring to me. He's lived in this Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, the gang capital of the world, literally, since 1984. And he was a part of starting this intervention program that now is known as Homeboy Industries. And here's essentially the vision behind what Homeboy Industries does. They build bridges by employing rival gang members to work alongside one another so that they can begin to not only get a foot in the door to find employment, to prepare for future employment, but also to have an opportunity to see the humanity in their enemies. When I first stumbled across Father Boyle's first book a few years ago, I was so moved as I was reading it. And not so much by the work that he does, although it is amazing. But what I found myself moved by even more was the way that he tells the stories of what he's experienced. It's these real, raw parables of transformation, including his own. And they're so reflective of the kind of God that Jesus describes in this parable that we've been looking at today. And if you find yourself in a place right now where you're feeling like, I just don't know that I have much to offer people around me. I just am feeling weary of serving, tired of investing. Or if you're in a place where you're having a hard time actually believing that God could be as generous, as loving, as for you as what we've seen in this parable today, maybe your next step would be actually to pick this book up. To add it to your summer reading list. You can order it on Amazon. You can pick it up at Connection Point by Sunday. They will be here. And I promise you, you will not regret it if you pick up and read this book. There is something so inspiring about it. I will give a disclaimer, there are some heavy themes in it. There's some stories that are difficult to read. There's also some colorful language, which if you've been around here for any length of time, that part probably won't bother you so much. But it's funny and it's hopeful. And my husband, who hates reading, actually, told me this week, he finished the book, which was amazing. And he was like, I still think about those stories almost once a week. And there's this one story that I want to tell you about in this book. It's about this boy named Pedro. And he was in rehab recently out of years of cocaine use. And he had just gotten the news about the tragic death of his little brother. And as Father Boyle is telling this story, he's describing it as one of many times where he finds himself in a situation where he is just dumbstruck by the pain that people are carrying, realizing that he really has nothing to offer him, but trusting that there is value in simply showing up for people. He talks about how when he went to pick Pedro up for the funeral, Pedro gets in the car and he started to tell him about a dream that he had the night before. He described how the two of them, Father Boyle and Pedro, were in his dream in this large, empty, pitch black room. Much like this, there was absolutely no light. And in Pedro's dream, Father Boyle found a flashlight. He took it out of his pocket, turned it on, and he shone it toward a light switch. And Pedro described how, though neither one of them said a word, he knew that he was the only one who could turn on the switch. And so he said he took a deep breath, he walked over to the light switch, and he flipped it on. And the room was filled with light. By this point in recounting the dream, Pedro was sobbing. And he said, as if discovering it for the very first time, the light was better than the darkness. Father Boyle said about that experience, I realized in that moment that possessing the flashlights and occasionally knowing where to aim them has to be enough for us. Fortunately, none of us can save anybody. But we all find ourselves in this dark, windowless room, fumbling for grace and flashlights. So you aim the light this time. I'll aim it the next. This is what it looks like to show up for people like God does in this parable. It's the reason that Crosspoint exists. It's the reason that we get so excited about people joining volunteer teams around here, because what we know, what we've experienced, is that when we show up, when we point our flashlights, when we shine a light, when we serve, when we offer what we have to share, the result is not only more light in other people's lives, it's more light in our lives too. Even, maybe especially, in our dark nights of waiting. You know, this is exactly what Jesus did too. As he began what he knew would be the last night before he was arrested, tried, crucified. On his darkest night, instead of focusing his energy on his own anguish, on his need, his attention was on helping his followers, helping us have places to turn in the midst of the waiting. On that night, he gathered his friends, this ragtag team. He gathered them around the table. And then he, their leader, their God, tied up his tunic. He stooped down and he served them. He washed their feet. And they resisted. They said, "No, you are our master. You shouldn't be doing this." But much like we see in this parable, he was setting an example. He was showing them, while you are waiting for me, do this. Wash other people's feet, serve, shine a light, show up, because that is where you will find me. That same night, Jesus took some of the food that was on the table, and he said, every time you eat this, remember me. Remember what I've taught you. Remember what I've given for you. Likewise, every time you drink from this cup, remember my covenant. Remember the way that I have cleared for you. He took these ordinary, everyday things that would have always been on their tables, and he transformed them into tools to sustain us in the waiting. Do this, eat this, remember. I can imagine that in the years to come, as those same friends would later come around other tables to celebrate and to remember, to do what Jesus told them to do, that sometimes they would not only think of that night, the night before Jesus was arrested when he gave them that instruction, but perhaps sometimes they would also think of that one time Jesus made up a story that sounded a lot like what they had experienced. That they'd say to each other, do you remember when Jesus told that story about a master who left the party early to come to be with his servants, to share the wedding feast with them? And that as they ate and as they drank, they would celebrate that this is the God who came to them and would come again. That they would experience the blessing of staying ready, of waiting expectantly, trusting that no matter what difficulty they were facing, Jesus would make good on his promise to show up for them. On your way in today, you had the opportunity to grab one of these bags, and I want to invite you to go ahead and take that now. If you're joining us online, you can grab literally anything to eat, anything to drink. Anything will do. And go ahead and take these pieces out today. As we wrap up, what we want to do is to give you the option to do exactly what they did, what Jesus' first disciples did, and what followers of Jesus have been doing ever since. To eat and drink as an act of remembering and celebrating Jesus, as an act of asking him to sustain you through whatever waiting you are in right now. This little Debbie cake, this ding dong or Twinkie or whatever it is that you found at the coffee shop or in your house, wherever you are, these are things that we use a lot around here to celebrate, and today is no different. And this is a reminder of that wedding feast, of the goodness that Jesus wants to bring into our lives through his presence. Similarly, this vial of juice reminds us of that wedding wine, which probably complemented that food a lot better than this juice is about to complement this little Debbie. But, we do our best. You get the idea, right? And together, these represent for us what Jesus has done for every one of us. How he left the party in heaven to be with us so that we might experience what it is to really live. And so as the band leads us in this last song, at your own pace, let's eat, let's drink, let's sing. And our prayer is that as you do, you might realize that God is actually right here among us, wherever you are, reaching out to you. Let's celebrate.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Take a moment to follow our podcast on your preferred platform, and be sure to download our app to stay informed on everything happening here at Crosspoint. And if you like what you heard today, don't hesitate to share it with a friend that might need to hear it too.